Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about Fnatic versus H2k from week 7, day 1 of the EU LCS. So last week was the week where Fnatic fully confirmed their credentials as the best team in Europe. So despite their long win streak, which was 12-0 at the end of week 6, and of course has now been extended to 14-0, some of these wins in week 6 and at the end of week 5 included shaky, very close wins against lower table teams, such as Giants, such as Gambit, and it was really only by beating Origin and H2k this week that they could firmly consolidate their standing as the best team in Europe. So as I've just done a 4-video series on how to beat Fnatic and analysing Fnatic's game style, I thought it would be interesting to look at how H2k and Origin tried to go about dealing with the Fnatic threat. So both teams actually put some of the things discussed in those videos into practice. For instance, the use of global ultimates in Shen support from H2k and Twisted Fate from Origin to counter Fnatic's 4-1 skirmish split push farming strategy. However, both teams made fundamental mistakes. Both teams, H2k and Origin, made fundamental mistakes, both in pick ban and in game, that gave Fnatic the chance to win. And Fnatic capitalized on these chances. So I've been covering a lot of Fnatic recently, but coming into playoffs and worlds, I think this is the key team to follow from Europe. And so I apologize that I've been doing a lot of Fnatic, but I think it's quite important that we have a look at Fnatic's game style and understand how Fnatic try to win games to inform the coverage of Fnatic going into Worlds and going into playoffs. Well, going into playoffs and into Worlds, of course. Fnatic haven't quite qualified for Worlds yet, but it's almost certain that they will do. So I also decided to do an NA game this week. Unfortunately, I chose TSM versus Team Liquid to look at rather than any of the Gravity games, and this was a particularly poor game, but one still worth discussing anyway, to see how these teams must improve if they're going to qualify for Worlds. I'll try to get to a Gravity game later this week if there's time, but this week I'm going to focus on 3 games. H2k versus Fnatic, Origin versus Fnatic, and then TSM versus Team Liquid. So back to Fnatic versus H2k. This was actually H2k's second game against Fnatic in 2 weeks. And as a quick reminder, this is a summary of what happened in the previous game in week 5, and this is the backdrop to the issues that H2k were trying to fix going into this game against Fnatic in week 7. So here's the pick ban from that game in week 5. So basically, as I said in the VOD review for this match, which I'm going to link just about here, the pick ban from this game was basically a disaster for H2k. So H2k picked a mid-game poke composition focused on Varus, Corki, and Rumble, who all spike on one item in the mid-game. Varus sort of with 2 reasonably cheap items in Mana Moon and Brutalizer. Rumble obviously being very powerful with 1 magic penetration item in level 6 or level 11 ultimate. And Corki obviously with the early game Trinity Force power spike. So on paper, this looked really good against Fnatic's scaling team composition that has 2 tiered stacking champions in Ryze and Jace, and an Olaf that doesn't exert heavy pressure in the early game. So you would expect H2k to be able to exert early pressure in this game. However, in reality, they were playing directly into Fnatic's hands, especially with this last pick Varus, which in my opinion should have been a champion which could exert some sort of split push pressure and stretch Fnatic's resources so that they could use their mid-game power spike to push towers. I think I mentioned in the video how a Yasuo in particular would have been a very good pick, especially against Fnatic's own poke. I mentioned Talon, but I made a mistake there. Of course, Ryu doesn't play Talon, but he does play a very good Yasuo, and I've actually seen him in person play Yasuo. He had a very, very good game on that back when he was playing for KT Bullets back in Korea. So why was this? Basically, H2k's composition didn't have enough hard engage to force a fight on Fnatic during their mid-game power spike. So I've covered this in great detail before, so again I won't go over everything. However, to summarize, Fnatic heavily valued disengage. So in this game we can sort of see 4 main sources of disengage from Fnatic. We have the Jace acceleration gate, Sivir ultimate, Olaf, Axes, and Janna. 4 good ways to disengage a fight. And as we discussed in the Fnatic series, Fnatic want to sort of 3-1-1 or 4-1 in the mid game and use their grouping as a 3 or 4 to skirmish around objectives and aggressively create map pressure to trade objectives in the mid game. And then what they're trying to do with this is to create map pressure to give their scaling component, who's always the top laner or the AD carry, to farm up safely. In this game, it was Huni's Rise, who was their scaling component, and this is how they're trying to win the late game. So they try to aggressively skirmish, and maybe they can win the 4v4 with these champions, but even if they fail to win the skirmish 4v4, they still have the Rise, the scaling component, to go into the late game and use in the late game. And this doesn't have to be Rise. Reckless has played very solid Kallistas and Jinxes, both of which are very good in the late game as well. So sometimes it's Huni, sometimes it's Reckless, who plays this late game hyper carry role. So this means that Fnatic have in recent weeks been prioritizing poke and disengage for 2 main reasons. So poke is a useful tool for setting up fights around neutral objectives. This is the sort of skirmish sort of style, and the disengage in their team composition ensures that they can position very aggressively as a 3 or 4 man unit and still be safe from potential fights when they might be outnumbered. So for instance, if we look at this team composition, Fnatic are in a good position to skirmish with Sivir, Olaf, Jace and Janna around, say, Dragon. But even if they're flanked, or even if Alistar flash pulverizes and they're stuck in a 4v5, they can very, very easily disengage with Sivir ultimate into acceleration gate, or just sacrifice Janna or use the Janna monsoon to go and create space and to go and escape, despite playing very, very aggressive on the map. So this means that when they're caught out, they don't suffer. It's not easy to punish them for this. So to go back to this game, H2k needed to force mid-game fights around objectives to be able to get a lead in the mid-game, or else they're going to be outscaled. The problem was that their main form of engage, which was Alistar Flash Pulverize and Rek'Sai Knockup, could be very easily disengaged with this Janna, and Fnatic, with this team composition, can keep their distance from H2k and force poke fights with Sivir and Jace. So the other thing to notice about this team composition for Fnatic is Fnatic's composition had very heavy wave clear. So it wasn't easy for H2k to push towers, although they were able to contest early dragons. Although their team was built to sort of contest early dragons, as their team composition was particularly effective in dragon fights, with the Rumble and the Corki in particular, and the Varus having Varus poke dealing more damage earlier on in the game than Jace. So Fnatic, on the other hand, just needed, with their heavy wave clear, just needed to wave clear until the mid-late game, where they can sort of use their Sivir, Jace acceleration gate tools to accelerate their short-range late-game hypercarry Rise into fights, into the H2k team, which lacks a little bit of disengage. So the game plan that Fnatic had, which was basically wave clear, avoid fighting during H2k's power spike, is only really at risk if Varus lands a very good multi-man ultimate into sort of a Rumble ultimate. But first of all, the Varus ult was very difficult to hit, and Olaf can still provide some sort of zoning potential once a Varus ult hits, because Olaf can, of course, ultimate Ragnarok out of the CC from Varus ult, and use the reasonably high amount of damage that a full tank Olaf can put out in order to try to zone the Corki or the Varus, so that Fnatic wouldn't be punished too badly if a multi-man Varus ult landed. And this is sort of the best case scenario for Fnatic. So sort of what happened in the game. So Fnatic played very well around their strengths and weaknesses of their team composition. So they capitalized on an early mistake from Odoamne, where he got caught in the bot lane under tower, surrounded and basically tower dove. And they used this sort of to trade objectives early, despite the fact that their team composition was in theory weaker in the early game. After they gained sort of a gold lead, they simply avoided fighting H2k for 8 minutes, between the sort of 20 and 28 minute mark, during H2k's main power spike, which was the rumble penetration items, and boots and Corki Triforce. And they simply just sort of stood at their turrets, wave clearing, and getting deep wards and things like this, whilst they got their rise fed. And this included sort of giving up a dragon in the mid game, in the sort of 20-minute mark, which they managed to get a lucky steal with from the Olaf axe. But the point is that they were avoiding fighting H2k during this power spike and just scaling to the late game. So, and then in the late game, their superior scaling team composition and team mobility, they just used this to chase down H2k and just won all the late game team fights and snowball this into victory. So essentially what happened in this game is H2k couldn't force fights during their power spike, and they picked a team composition that could be outscaled late game, provided that Fnatic didn't fall too far behind early, which was unlikely. And even if this happened, it was unlikely that H2k would be able to push this advantage simply because of Fnatic's large amount of wave clear. So, and we can see some of these issues, the failure to prioritize engage, the failure to pick team compositions which have sort of a security button. So Fnatic could afford to mess up in the early game, because they would always have the rise late game to wait until. But H2k tend not to like to play these sorts of compositions, and tend to just sort of like to snowball games early. And this is very, very difficult to do against a team which is so good at trading objectives, such as Fnatic. So let's go and have a look at some of these issues, and how they attempted to resolve them in their Week 7 draft. So, actually, however, before I go and get into this game, before I go into analysing this pick ban myself, I'm just going to link to the post-game analysis from Rockat's coach Jamato Cannon and Origin's coach Leduc. I think that both coaches actually had some valid criticisms of Prolly's, that's H2K's coach, Prolly's strategy in pick bans, but I feel that they don't quite sort of understand what H2K were thinking during this pick ban, and so I feel that some of these points are unfairly critical of H2K. I don't think actually that this pick ban from H2K was a disaster, but there were a couple of flaws in it that I will come to in a second, after we've gone and listened to these coaches, which Fnatic were able to capitalize on. And I think it's worth just using these coaches' analysis in order to build our own analysis afterwards. So I'm just going to...
Because you guys, if I could have recorded it, you guys were just quite disappointed in H2K's draft. That's understating.
Let's start off with the bans, because sort of like the plan from H2K here is target Reignover. Reignover, if you look at the champions he played in the jungle so far, were mainly on the Gragas and the Rek'Sai side and the Olaf side. So if you ban the Rek'Sai and the Olaf and you first rotate the Gragas, you force Reignover on something new. I hope that H2K knew it was the Rengar, because it was something that was very visible from Reignover's solo queue accounts. And yeah, they pretty much wanted to push Reignover out of his comfort zone and onto a non-tier jungle while getting the Gragas. So that part of the strategy was actually really solid.
Okay, so firstly, just going and answering the first comment from Leduc. So firstly, I just want to say that there's no way that H2K were not expecting Rengar here. All teams follow each other's solo queue accounts at LCS level, and it should have been obvious that Reignover was practicing other champions than Gragas, Olaf, and Rek'Sai. And you cannot assume that H2K don't have this information. I mean, they have both a coach and analyst to pick up on this stuff. Okay. Just going to skip this.
The Rek'Sai and the Olaf, and you first...
Okay. But I think the point here is that H2K are not targeting Reignover specifically. They're targeting Fnatic's sort of propensity to run poke team compositions with heavy disengage to allow time for their late game scaling compositions to win games with them. So by forcing Reignover off Gragas and Olaf, they force Fnatic to either run a different style of team composition to the one that they've been winning with in recent weeks, or they force Huni to act as the secondary disengage. And this forces Reckless to play the sort of hyper carry role on a Jinx if they want to have a late game scaling component, because of course because Fnatic banned the Kalista. And this means that either Fnatic don't have the late game scaling component in their composition, which they really, really like to run to attempt to outscale late game, or they run this composition with limited disengage in the skirmish part of their composition. So either they don't have the one, if you imagine Fnatic as a 4-1 split team, they don't have the one scaling composition member, or they try to skirmish with the four other members without disengage. So either of these two things is a higher risk strategy. Okay, and just to go back to Raynova, so it's not like Raynova, who's a professional League of Legends player after all, is not capable of running other champions in the jungle. And for other teams who are trying to go and ban Raynova out, I mean, it's just worth remembering that we already know from Spring Split that Raynova is a very decent Jarvan player, and earlier in his career he played a very, very good Eve when he was back in Korea. So I don't think this criticism of H2k, this categorization of H2k's pick ban, that it's targeting Raynova is valid. Actually, what H2k are doing is they're targeting Fnatic's disengage in this pick ban. And basically they want to bait Fnatic into running their preferred poke style champion whilst limiting their disengage poke style's team composition whilst limiting their disengage options with these bans. And first pick, obviously the Gragas first pick, denying from Raynova. So
the Gragas, you forced Raynova on something new. I hope that H2k knew it was the Ranger, because it was something that was very visible from Raynova's solo queue accounts. And yeah, they pretty much wanted to push Raynova out of his comfort zone and onto a non-tier jungle while getting the Gragas. So that part of the strategy was actually really solid. But then it gets wacky.
Oh, let me start where it gets rocky, right? Like, in the second rotation, they just pick a Gnar and a Shen. And it makes very little sense because it's not contested picks. It's not picks that are going to disappear from your hand simply because the enemy team has revealed the Rumble already. While in reality, the pick that was contested was the Jace. I think we talked about the Jace for a straight 5 minutes about how it was contested.
Yes, and they talked about this in the preview for the match, and this is actually something I quite disagree with. H2k very clearly had expected Fnatic to pick this Jace, and they had a plan for handling Jace during the laning phase and for limiting Jace's effectiveness in the early game, and they were hoping to keep Jace down in the early laning phase with Victor, and I'll explain when I get into the game itself why Victor is a good counter into Jace. And basically they were trying to sort of semi-bait Fnatic into picking the Jace. I don't necessarily agree with this style of play, but this is what I think H2k were thinking. And it was very clear once Fnatic took the Corki Rumble in their first rotation that they were going to pick an AD mid laner, and it was very, very likely, given Fnatic's preference for high wave clear team compositions and poke team compositions, that this was either going to be a Jace or it was going to be a Varus or something like this. And H2k had a workaround that they were going to work on. And this is why I haven't covered the preview for this game. I'm only covering the post-game analysis, because there's a lot of what these two coaches said in the pre-game that I really, really disagreed with. But I'm not here to criticize or argue about other coaches. I'm here just to analyze the game. So
and it was just shocking that it just passed away through the ban and pick.
Yeah.
It starts off with, like, first up we were thinking that Jace might be a first rotation from Fnatic, and then in the second rotation H2k had the opportunity to go Alistar Jace, and they would have set up for such a good team comp, and then they end up also giving away the Jace when Fnatic already has the Corki and the Rumble in the first rotation, which somewhat hints towards this poke style comp. And they also didn't pick Engage. They just had no Engage. There was a Shenton and a Gragas, completely unreliable. And you have to know this is coming. Like, Fabian is infamous for his Jace.
Okay, so although I slightly disagree with the Jace. I mean, I think that H2k should have taken the Jace, but I can see the game plan that they're trying to have against this Jace. So, which they're trying to pick the Victor into the Jace and see how it does. Remember that this is only a normal season game. It's not a playoff game, so they can sort of test if their counter strategy to Jace works in this game. So I don't dislike that too much, especially because it was clear that H2k had a very reasonable game plan for dealing with this Jace. On the other hand, I think that Leduc, who is Origin's coach, is correct here to the extent that it is surprising that H2k don't pick the Jace or the Alistar, and that H2k don't have sufficient engage in this team composition. So the biggest tell that Fnatic are sort of looking to Jace mid is that they pick their 2 heavy magic dealers in their first rotation. I'll just go back to the draft so that we can go and have a look at it. That is at the 11 minute, 6 minute 27. No, sorry, 11 minute 27. Okay, so I'll just leave this up here, but this last pick is going to be Jace. So I think the biggest mistake that H2k make is misunderstanding Fnatic's variable prioritization on Alistar. So I sort of understand why they don't pick the Jace. They have a plan to counter it. But I think that the Alistar, not picking the Alistar, is a big mistake. And I can understand why H2k make this mistake. Basically, Fnatic haven't been prioritizing Alistar this year. They played him if he's open, but they're often happy to take Nautilus, Janna, etc., etc., etc. The problem here is that Fnatic like to run Janna in a particular type of team composition, which is their 4-1 split poke, scaling team composition. And in that team composition, they use Janna as their primary disengage. And once they pick the Corki Rumble, it's clear that this is not that composition. Because remember, Fnatic like to run their scaling component in the AD carry position or top lane, and these 2 champions are early mid-game spiking champions, Corki and Rumble. So, Fnatic with their first 2 pick indicate that with the disengage jungle bans and ADC bans, they can first pick. They can pick Rumble and Corki in the first rotation and attempt to play a mid-game focused team composition like H2k ran in week 5. Sort of this sort of team composition that H2k ran in week 5. And in this sort of composition, Alistar is an excellent pick. The reason why it didn't work for H2k in week 5 is because of all this disengage that's here on Fnatic. But if you look here, by the 3rd pick, H2k don't have this level of disengage. They have the Gragas Barrel, but Shen and Nard aren't really champions which are excellent at disengaging. In the same way that a Janna or an Olaf or a Sivir or a Jace can help you disengage. So basically what happened in this draft is that H2k were prepared to play against a typical default Fnatic team composition and simply couldn't adapt their strategy fast enough in reaction to Fnatic's early draft adjustments. And this is the mistake. So once these 2 champions were picked, it should have been clear that Fnatic was running a different type of game plan and a different type of team composition to the one that they've typically been running in previous weeks. And H2k don't adapt to this. And this is the big problem. So this is what I agree with Leduc. So I agree with the sort of that H2k don't prioritize the Alistar aggressively enough. On the other hand, I disagree with Leduc that H2k want to be prioritizing hard engage versus Fnatic's team composition. I mean, to put it simply, against a Corki Rumble early mid-game power spike team, you don't want to hard engage and force team fights, especially in the mid-game. So you either want to be split pushing to split the team up, to trade objectives, because Rumble's not the best 1v1 champion versus split push, and Shen is great in that sort of game plan. I mean, they can't really gank top. Top isn't with one member, because Shen can just ultimate. And sort of Shen fits into this game plan really, really well. You want the disengage, which of course Alistar would have provided, simply because you're not going to beat Corki Rumble in early mid-game team fights. You're just not going. Once Corki has his power spike and Rumble has haunting guys like that, this team is going to deal a lot more damage than you can deal with pretty much any team composition you can think of. And H2K sort of want the disengage, and Gragas already offers that disengage. So I disagree with Leduc that H2K should have been prioritizing the disengage. But I think the bigger mistake that H2K make is showing their support Shen too early and picking Na Shen in this rotation. So this reveals to Fnatic early in the draft that H2K would lack reliable engage from top jungle support, and they revealed this very, very early in the draft, rather than conceding this by, for instance, picking the Shen here and a non-top lane or support champion here. And I don't think the problem is that H2K don't pick engage. I think the problem is that they show Fnatic early in the draft that their team composition is going to be weak on reliable engage. And this is the problem. So if they hide this fact until later on in the draft, then no problem at all. But the fact that they reveal it so early in the draft is a major, major issue. So, and I think that the engage issue is more of an issue in the mid game rather than in late game. Because, for instance, in the late game, if engage is required, it's possible to buy Righteous Glories, Talisman of Ascension, these sorts of things to help facilitate the weakness. The problem with H2K's draft is more that they pick a team composition which had very little late game damage and thus would still be outscaled by Fnatic, even though Fnatic have a very strong early mid game composition. And as a result, they sort of needed to engage to fight Fnatic before they got outscaled. But even with this sort of hypothetical hard engage, which they don't have, but even if they had it, you're picking engaged champions into a mid-game Rumble Corki team composition. I mean, how are you going to win these team fights unless Fnatic misposition really, really badly? The correct way to play this game was to use Shen and Gragas to disengage and sort of pick heavy scaling champions at AD carry and mid, but they don't do that, and I'm going to go and cover this now quickly and explain why they don't. So basically, so this is just covering what Leduc and Yamato Cannon, two other LCS coaches, thought about this draft. So was this draft a disaster for H2K, like their sort of week 5 draft? Actually, I think in some ways this was a sensible draft strategy against the team composition that Fnatic normally like to run. The problem is that Fnatic switched from their usual type of game plan because of how the pick ban went, and H2K's team composition was not able to compete. In particular, in terms of damage in mid-game team fights, basically, rather than sort of a strategic weakness coming into the draft, I feel this draft from H2K was more of a failure to adapt to a new strategy on the fly, probably because they tunneled and practiced for a particular style of Fnatic game plan that Fnatic simply didn't run in this game, and therefore H2K were not able to change from the strategy that they'd already penciled in to fight against Fnatic. So before focusing on these sort of mistakes within the H2K draft, I want to look at what H2K did well in this draft and how this would have countered a normal Fnatic team composition, which is the sort of 4-1 split poke disengage team composition. So as I said above, H2K forced Reignover off a disengaged jungle champion, which means that Fnatic lose their disengage from the jungle and are forced to play a more engaged heavy team composition. So this is the first thing that they did well. And what ends up happening is Reignover ends up on Rengar, a jungler which doesn't synergize particularly well with what Fnatic are trying to do in this game, and which applies basically no early game pressure compared to Gragas. So thus, in theory, this reduced the pressure from Fnatic's sort of early game lane bully champions, Corki and Rumble. Simply because Gragas is going to apply more pressure in the early game, and this in theory should mean that Corki and Rumble aren't able to play as aggressively as they would like to play. So that's the first thing they do well. Secondly, by forcing Fnatic to ban Kalista and Sivir, they ensure that Fnatic are not going to be able to play the poke disengage scaling composition that Fnatic beat them with in week 5. If they want scaling, this is going to have to come from the top lane, but with no good disengage jungles remaining, except for maybe J4 Alt Flash as a sort of form, a kind of disengage. If Fnatic want to run disengage, it's going to have to come mainly from support. Thirdly, they pick a second global in this Shen support, and I think this is very, very smart against Fnatic. So I've discussed in great detail sort of the importance of picking non-top lane globals against Fnatic's top-focused mid-game split push style of play in previous videos. So whilst there are advantages and disadvantages to support Shen versus other globals that the team could run, I think against a team like Fnatic, if you don't want to run a TP from mid lane or Twist of Fate mid lane, it's very important to run a global from support. And as discussed in previous videos, Shen can at least take an offensive summoner, which means that he's going to be able to contribute a reasonable amount of damage in early game jungle skirmishes. Actually, despite all the the talking up of Shen, I think, ironically, I actually think that this is one game where TP support, so getting your global from support via TP, so a TP support Annie or Alistair would actually have been better in this game than Shen. Even though I think that Shen is normally the best way to provide this sort of global from your support. Because basically H2k are lacking hard engage, and with the Annie Alistair, they'd have been able to use their support for home guard, crowd control, flank late game, and they'd have still gained the sort of global pressure from an Annie Alistair. And basically, sorry, just for people who haven't seen the previous videos, the reason why you want your global on your support in the bot lane is because this is a very top lane focused meta, and Fnatic are a team which like to gank for top a lot. And if you have a global on your support, it makes it very hard to tower dive top laners. Either when the top, this is either in the 1v1 where there's a jungle gank and the jungle and the top laner try to tower dive the other top laner. The Fnatic, Reynova and Huni try to tower dive the enemy top laner, because then you can threaten the support coming in via TP or via Shen ultimate in order to offer support. Or in the 2v1, because in the 2v1 you can often try a 3v1 dive, but then you're risking the Shen coming in and defending the top laner from the 3v1 dive, and this means you sort of have to commit 4 people if you want to get a reliable dive. And I think that globals on your support is very, very strong in this metagame. And Shen, this is why we're seeing all these support Shens, but I think you could still gain the benefits from support Shen if you run a TP on your support, so flash TP support, but this means that your support is going to be weaker in early game jungle skirmishes. And this is why Shen is better at running this role than putting support on an Alistair or an Annie or that sort of thing. But again, go and watch the video, go and watch my video, the 4th video on how to beat Fnatic. I cover this in, I'm not going to cover the advantages of teleport support in this video, but I cover it in huge detail there. But the point I think here is that support Shen is actually strategically a very good pick into how Fnatic like to play the game, the League of Legends game right now. So H2k did 3 very good things in the draft. However, I think H2k made 2 key mistakes in this pick ban, and I think this cost them the pick ban and later the game. So firstly, they undervalued Alistair. So it's true that Fnatic haven't been prioritizing Alistair in recent weeks, preferring the Janna. However, this is because they've been running scaling skirmish poke team compositions where Janna's disengage really, really shines. And once Fnatic lock in Rumble and Corki, as I said before, it should be immediately clear that Fnatic are not going to be playing for the late game with their team composition, and will want to fight H2k early. So Alistair is very good at facilitating these early game team fights, especially as H2k don't have great disengage with these first 3 picks. And Alistair can act as a frontline if Reynova takes a non-tank jungler, unlike sort of other engaged champions that Fnatic might have picked if H2k had taken away the Alistair in this rotation, such as Annie. So Alistair can act as a solo frontliner in mid and late game teamfights, whereas Annie isn't really tanky enough, nor is Nautilus. I mean, they are reasonably tanky, but they're not tanky enough to play the solo frontline role that Alistair can play. And considering most of the best tank junglers were taken, this is incredibly important because Fnatic picked this Alistair, they're able to pick a slightly less tank-focused jungler in Rengar, because they've already got some sort of frontline in the Alistair. Also, just imagine how strong Alistair would have been with teleport on H2k side in this game. Even a sort of standard support without teleport, Alistair would have been a great pickup, providing sustain against Fnatic's poke from Corki Rumble, and giving a powerful early game frontline for H2k to fight with if they needed to fight during Rumble and Corki's early game power spike. Because Alistair spikes very, very early too. He spikes at level 6 and level 11 very, very as you know, very, very hard, even without items. He spikes with levels. And even if Fnatic take Janna into this Alistar, as they've been doing in previous weeks, without a hyper carry AD carry or a hyper carry top laner, Janna's disengage role is less important than it was, for instance, in Fnatic's Team 5 composition here. The second mistake H2K make is here in their sort of second rotation, where they pick Shen and Gnar. So by picking Shen and Gnar early, they show their hand for what they're going to be trying to do in this pick ban too aggressively. Firstly, it shows that they're almost certain to be taking AP mid laner. Otherwise, they're going to have no AP damage in their team. So Fnatic don't need to prioritize their most likely AD mid laner in their second rotation, because Corki and Rumble do a lot of magic damage, so it's almost certain that Fnatic are going to be picking an AD mid laner. Secondly, they lose out a lot on the pressure surprise of picking the Shen early on in the draft and having the potential to flex it as a top laner or support. So it's true that Shen's not as good into Rumble as Gnar, which I think is why they picked the Gnar. But the threat of a top lane Shen's global map pressure and split pushing might have forced Fnatic into making different picks in their second rotation, and then they could have picked the Gnar later in the draft, if that's still what they wanted. The biggest issue with this sort of Shen, Gragas, Gnar, first three picks in the draft, frontline, is that firstly they're very, very damage light, first two picks, which puts H2K in a catch-22 position. So Fnatic know if they pick heavy engage with their third and fourth pick, which is what they do, they're going to be able to immediately blow up any immobile hyper carry that H2K pick. However, if H2K don't pick a hyper carry champion with their fourth or fifth pick, the team simply isn't going to do enough damage to be relevant in late game team fights, and we see this happen here. So Lucian is sort of a sort of an early mid-game AD carry that doesn't... Sort of H2K have a dual threat team, but Lucian is a champion which falls off quite dramatically as the game goes on, so they don't have any damage in this team. You know, their only sources of damage in this game are Victor and Lucian. And this just isn't enough damage, especially against a Rengar which is building tank and an Alistar. So what should H2K have done instead? So H2K should have picked the Shen here and either pick their AD carry or their mid laner here. Now, and their AD carry, would either have been Jinx or Lucian Graves, which would have given them some sort of disengage, so I think that's fine. Or their mid laner, it's okay to pick their mid laner here, third pick, because their mid laner is going to be counter pick, last pick anyway. So if H2K had done that, they hide information from Fnatic. So imagine if they picked an AD carry or a mid laner here instead of Gnar. Fnatic have to respect the possibility of a Shen top, and they're either not going to know if H2K are going to play a scaling AP top laner such as Ryze and flex this Shen to support, or they're not going to know if H2K are going to pick a mid-game or late-game AD carry if they pick their mid-lane champion here. So this Gnar Shen gives too much information away about H2K's plan with team composition and lets Fnatic pick around it. And this is a mistake that H2K have shown their tank line too early in this game, and Fnatic can see the weaknesses of this sort of thing. Actually, as I will go into in the video, I actually think the Victor's quite a good pickup, and it's able to bully Jace early in the lane, especially after first back, and provide some sort of disengage, which is something which H2K need. So they have the double disengage here with Victor Static Field, I think it's called, and Gragas Ultimate, which means that they don't have to fight Fnatic in this sort of early game. It gives them two forms of disengage. I mean, it's true that Fnatic might still be able to engage onto them, but at least they have the disengage and the zone control. So I think this supplements this fits very, very well into H2K's team composition. But I think it's the order that they pick the champions which matters. So to summarize, basically I think H2K's draft was better in week 7 than week 5. However, the underlying problems are still the same in this team composition as in their week 5 team composition. Whereas in week 5 they're trying to play poke in, it's a contest of 2 poke composition, with limited, a mid-game poke composition with limited engage into Fnatic's far superior scaling poke disengage composition. In this game, they end up giving Fnatic the perfect early mid-game skirmish team composition: Rumble, Corki, Alistar, with Jace poke, and without a hyper carry, AD carry, or top laner, due to the order that they pick in the draft. They have too little damage late game to be able to comfortably outscale this Fnatic team composition. So they're forced to try to win mid-game skirmishes because they're going to be outscaled. And this is something which Fnatic are very good at fighting, but even if they manage to catch Fnatic out, H2k don't have enough reliable engage to go and force these fights which they need to force because they're going to be outscaled in the late game because their team composition has no damage late. Secondly, sort of as in the week 5, so Fnatic can force the team fights early when they're in their power spike, which is something which H2k couldn't force with their week 5 mid-game focus composition. Secondly, sort of in their week 5 draft, H2k simply have not prioritized hard engage. So even though they will be outscaled if the game drags on, which they're going to be with this team composition, they have no way to force fights before they're outscaled, and Fnatic are perfectly capable of just wave clearing to late game if they fall behind early. And this is the same problem that H2k have had in the past against Fnatic. And it's something that they really have to work on if they want to beat Fnatic in playoffs. Either you aim to outscale Fnatic in the late game, or you have to pick hard engage to force fights on Fnatic. You have to have more hard engage and engage than Fnatic have disengaged. And they never have enough hard engage to force the fights before they're outscaled. And I think if they're going to keep doing this into playoffs, then they really have to pick better scaling team compositions. So for Fnatic, this is sort of a departure from their normal style of gameplay that they've been using in the last 2 weeks towards a team composition that is more engage early game focused. However, because of their good draft, they still managed to create a team composition which should outscale H2k late game due to H2k's lack of safe damage sources in the early game, especially against an Alistar. Okay, so that was it for pick bans, and in the second video I'm going to go and talk a little bit more about the game itself.